All right, sorry about that. Some technical difficulties tonight. Good evening. Welcome to the Church Safety Guys Sunday night broadcast. My name is Mike Scully. I have the floor tonight. We had some emergent situations with Paul. Had to go be the valiant one and rescue his wife, and James has a church event with bigwigs and so forth that he had to lead. So tonight is the replay with Matt Coombes, and we will jump into that shortly here. But if you are watching, be sure to type in the chat. Let us know where you're watching from, and feel free and add questions as well. I'll try to address anything that we can that is not during the replay itself, being the one-man show tonight. But thanks for joining us, and we'll get started in just a second here.
All right, good evening and welcome to the pre-recorded Church Safety Guys episode. And we are going to be talking about executive protection tonight. And Paul brought in a special guest with a great deal of experience, far more than him or I, mostly him, because he trained Paul. So anyhow, Paul, I'm going to turn it over to you, and you can introduce Matt to us.
Yeah, so this is something I've been waiting for a while. I've got 3 instructors that have heavily influenced my life, and Matt's one of them. So Matt Coombes, Shield Force International. I'm going to miss stuff, so you're going to have to come in behind me here, and we'll let you kind of jump in and give a little bit of your pedigree and your background. So Matt has trained boxing, martial arts, knife, handgun, rifle. He trains law enforcement, anti-ambush tactics. He's got a lot of experience in law enforcement. He's got a background with de-escalation. He teaches medical. He has a full suite of things he can teach your church. And he's got a background in executive protection and security work that goes from working next door to a store that's received a threat all the way over to running alongside tier 1 operators overseas. I wish I could download your brain, Matt, at Matrix style and know how to fly a helicopter and know Kung Fu. Every time I can get to one of Matt's classes, I go. A lot of you guys heard me talk about the knife defense class. That was with Matt. The ridge on the side of my arm is only just now not sore. Somebody asked me what that was like, and I said, imagine getting hit with a ruler every minute and a half for about 7 hours. And they started laughing, and I was like, and I loved every minute of it. So what did I miss?
Oh, thank you. I appreciate the kind words of what you've said, having an impact on your life. That's ultimately my goal at the end of every day, is that I can impact other people. That's how I came up with my motto for my company in the beginning, and that was no victims here. And, I started in law enforcement actually as a teenager, even as a volunteer cadet. And, so from the point I was a teenager, I've been in police cars responding to people's houses that were victimized. And they would report to me, hey, this happened to me, this happened to me. I've been a victim. And, from somebody that cared about others, that loved other people, that had a training background, even from, into a childhood, I knew what it would have taken to make that interaction different. And so it's like, if I could have just met you yesterday and given you this much training, or this much information. Today, when this thing happened, when this bad guy came and impacted your life, if you would have known that, you would have stood up at the end of this day and said, no victims here. And so that's why I kind of developed that motto for my company, is through training and education. And I've learned that through my life. The more training I took, the more education I took, the more prepared I was, the more humble I could be, the less I feared or stressed about any situation that would arise in my life, especially when I was on the street being a police officer. And so, no victims here, that's the goal. And so for you to give me that compliment, Paul, that it's impacted your life, that it's made a difference for you, given you more confidence, that's mission accomplished for me. I started training at a young age. I started law enforcement really early. Fortunately, I started at kind of a smaller agency. It was in between a small to a large agency. So I wouldn't call it small, but mid-sized. And, I got to wear multiple hats, and they promoted me to an instructor early on. So I started teaching, defensive tactics, firearms, use of force. That kind of spun off into flashbang instructor, less lethal instructor, verbal de-escalation. And then when I started my company, same thing. I researched out as many different instructor level schools as I could attend, because I wanted to be a one-stop shop for both law enforcement and church security. What I would say about my background, I get asked a lot, what makes me different than the next guy over? There's a lot of great, tier 1 operators. There's a lot of military guys. There's a lot of law enforcement guys that are out there training churches. And, each one of them brings their own specific level of experience, and experiences to the table. So, for instance, a Marine Corps guy, he's going to bring to the church security realm what he learned in the Marine Corps. A law enforcement, a police officer, and I can tell you firsthand, being a police officer, they don't train you or teach you anything on church security. You may think you know how to do church security, but you really don't know anything if you're being honest and humble about it until you actually get out of that. Now, you have a certain level of understanding of tactics, but what I commonly see and what sets me apart is a lot of law enforcement guys will come in and they try to tell churches what they need to be, what they need to do to be secure. And sometimes they miss the core mission of the church, and they jeopardize that, and they step on toes, and it just doesn't work. Or the tactics and training level that they're trying to push on a church, it just isn't going to work for a bunch of ordinary, average civilian folk that are only going to dedicate a few hours a month, if that, to try to keep people safe. And so I've developed a system, so to speak, or a program for church security that I know firsthand works in the real world. It works for real people, real civilians. They can deploy that. And growing up in church my entire life, my brother is a pastor, my uncle's a pastor. I have a heart for Christ, and I understand why we're here at church. And, sure, we can keep everybody safe if we lock the doors, but that's going to jeopardize our core mission. So everything I do in the training realm to help churches, I screen it through that and make sure that it enhances the core mission of the church.
That's awesome. I'm going to jump in here because one thing that you mentioned, I wanted to chat with you for a second about. Well, actually, two things. The first thing that you mentioned is humility, and I love that. I love, because so often, and that's kind of why the church safety guys got started, because we really were looking for that attitude, because you can always learn something, you can always train, and the more information you have, yes, the better suited, the more calm you are handling that situation, because the potential outcomes and the ins and outs of that. But humility is just such an underrated characteristic for folks to understand that.
Sure.
They're not. I mean, I've worked with law enforcement. I continue to train with law enforcement. I'm not a peace officer. But at the end of the day, it's like, what, I'm constantly looking for more training and trying to keep that, I guess, humility attitude for myself when I train, that I may be better than some, but there's tons of people that are better than me, and including Paul, and I'm not going to go down that list of attributes. But the other thing too that you mentioned that I think is really cool is the aspect of law enforcement being taught church relations and church training and church security. And one of the things that I'm starting to see in the academic area is that colleges are starting to put a church safety, church security component to like their some cases it's a whole class, but it's basically, a 3-credit session where they're starting to say, this is how you relate to places of worship and churches and that sort of thing.
Wow.
And I've had several conversations with local law enforcement around me. I'm in Central Ohio, where I've had police officers come to me and say, can we train with your safety team, because we don't understand churches and we don't understand how they work. And, I've had several chiefs come to me and say that, and kudos to them, because, I don't look at like our setup in our church as, we have the corner on the best things to do. We're always evaluating and moving forward, but it's very true. And I think for the longest time, and I'll throw it over to Mike see if he has anything, but for the longest time, I think the run, hide, fight all the way down to what we're training people on today, it's great for schools. It's great, to get that information and get it branded and out there. But I think just now people are starting to realize that churches are kind of a different animal. So having somebody that can understand that and be as experienced as you are is really an awesome resource.
Right. Yeah, here recently, two different things to tie into that. First, a law enforcement guy who, several years, 15 plus years in law enforcement, had been going around to some of the churches in my area, telling them that if an active shooter came into the building, just have one of your security guys stand up and yell, get down on the ground. And then everybody with one accord would lay down on the floor, leaving you and the bad guy as the only two standing up. So you'd have a clear path to shoot him across the sanctuary. And, it's like, okay, wow. So kind of having to go through and clear that up. And then I was teaching a class in Kansas, and it was a pretty large multi-organizational church group class. And I guess the police chief down there found out about it, and somebody, mentioned it to him. And so he called and asked if they could come and train with me. And on the last class, it was a 3-day training class. On the last day, we always run our scenario-based trainings. So we touched on what we want them to know, how we want them to respond to different things. We kind of open up their minds to certain aspects of church security, and then we test that on it. And I ran 16 of the most common scenarios that churches are faced with, ranging from a verbal altercation all the way to a hostage situation. And, it was very eye-opening for the law enforcement guys, not saying anything negative about them, but they, at the end of the day, was like, wow, we didn't know what we don't know. We had no idea. Some of these guys who are just church security folks, they responded to some of the scenarios better than we did as police officers, just because this is so different than what we deal with in law enforcement on the street. So, I think we definitely need to start bringing law enforcement in with churches and letting them train together as much as possible, because, like Sun Tzu says, know thy enemy, but know thy friend as well. And so when you're law enforcement, you're responding to a building that has an armed security team. You kind of want to know how they're going to operate, what they're going to do, what their game plan is. Even though we recommend that once law enforcement arrive on scene, the security team, the volunteer security team, should turn it over to the law enforcement and say, hey, we're done, we're tapping out. We turn it over to them, but they still need to have an idea of understanding of when they first arrive, there could be other armed offenders there.
Yep. And that's an excellent point. We've had different training days, training scenarios, that sort of thing, where we've had multiple agencies come and do active shooter drills and other drills at our church. Our church is about 150,000 square foot building.
Yeah.
And so what always, really kind of warms me is when, I have officers or chiefs come to me and say, I really wish that your church was in my town, so that, so that when we came in the building, we trust you guys enough to know to work with you. And we know how you're going to clear, because you train, clear a room or clear 100,000 square feet, because we know it. And we know that we can trust you. And that's, to me, that's like the largest compliment. But, that's definitely something Paul and I have said many, many times over the last few years, is that, reach out to your local law enforcement, offer them a place to train, interact with them. And, it just makes everything better for everyone. But
Sure.
I'll turn it over to Mike. You had something?
Sure. I think I picked up a little bit where you were originally talking, Matt, and I think the idea of understanding the church security animal, if you will. If we unpack that a little bit in the sense that we got a wide-ranging demographic of volunteers, okay, many of which may not have served in military, may not have served in law enforcement, realistically may not even be equally yoked for serving in a safety team, but they are in that capacity. And I think there's different degrees of maturity that we have across the spectrum of those that serve in that capacity. But I think the desire we talk about a lot here of always training, I think is really key. But I think the key there to that, though, is understanding, again, that demographic. How do you reach a church security team that may or may only get one invested training per year if they're lucky? And if they're an even smaller church, you're talking about those of us that are the enthusiast side of it, those that are going to seek out our own training to improve ourselves on the side, not necessarily collectively as a church team. But look at I always like to look at people who are willing to invest both time, money, and effort and so forth. But look at, okay, if you're a 2, what can I do to make you a 3? If you're a 5, what can I do to make you a 6? And instead of always the shtick of, you're a beginner, you're a green bean, here's how you learn a little bit, really trying to fine tune that machine into something that's usable. And so I really like that you have that understanding of the church, that humility, to James' point, which I think is a necessary item and component to understand, but also relate and say, at the end of the day, we're going to deliver and try to help impart knowledge so that you become subject matter experts within your facility, but understand that we've given you this much, the tip of the iceberg.
And that's the thing, you've hit it on the head. And I've had the conversation with a few other, tactical trainers that do not offer training to church security teams. And they said, why do you do this? You know who you're training. You know they're not a bunch of, top tier assets. You know they're not going to do everything you say. You know they're probably going to fail. They're not going to take the training seriously. They're not going to train as much as they should to adequately, face a real life threat. So, why do you even do that? And to me, it's not an all or nothing concept. Like you said, how can we go from a 3 to a 4? Because next year, I'm still going to be around. They're going to take another class next year. And then next year, they might take 3 classes. And then the year after that, they might budget for 5. But if nobody ever comes along to even open their eyes, so to speak, they're never going to move from where they currently are. And so to me, it's not an all or nothing. No, I never want a church that I go in, one time that takes a 4-hour or 8-hour class, then later has an active shooter come in and then it get published, oh, well, Shield Force trained them. That's bad for business. And that's why a lot of people, I think, chooses not to train people like that, or have certain standards that if you don't take 6 classes, I'm not going to train you at all. I believe in God and I have faith. I pray for the best, but I train for the worst. And I want to give everybody the opportunity to get training. And we all start at different levels. To go back to the type of person, the candidate that we're looking for, I'm looking for a servant and a warrior mindset second. I can train a warrior mindset. You give me somebody with the Ness brother philosophy, right? If you've never heard of the Ness brothers, 3 brothers ending with Ness, right? Willingness, decisiveness, aggressiveness. Paul's smiling. He's probably said this before. He got this from me. Yeah. So, if I can get a candidate that's willing and decisive and aggressive, I can make them into what I want them to be if they have a servant's heart. If I have a warrior mindset and he's not a servant's heart, it's very hard for me to teach a servant's heart in 16 to 24 hours. So that's what we're looking for in church security candidates, and I can teach them the rest.
I love that. Honestly, one of the things that I say often is I use the acronym FAT: faithful, available, and teachable. Yeah. And I have trained churches, and I've worked with churches over the course of multiple years and trained people from shooting to, just basic maneuvering tactics and that sort of thing. And what's a blessing to me is, you're absolutely right. People that I was told, you know what, he's not good. Leave him alone or leave her alone. Don't invest in that person. I'm seeing now 2 years later, I invested in that person. 2 years later, I'm seeing them, out scrimmage, outshoot me. And I'm just like, after that training, I'm like, that's awesome. Praise the Lord. Because you know what? You were open and you had a heart to actually understand and learn versus someone that comes in and doesn't have that humility, or someone that comes in and says, well, I know everything anyway. I don't need to be there. I was in the military, and I don't mean that as a bash on the military. I work for the military. So,
well, we just don't know what we don't know.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
And I hear that all the time from Paul, all the time.
But I want to jump in right now because this is where I start to get excited. I've met people in law enforcement or that were in law enforcement that are in church safety, and I've met people with the most incredible heart. There's a guy I go to church with. When a guy came in, he doesn't look right. He was kind of socially awkward and causing some problems. And I'm kind of a reservist, and they bring me in and ad hoc, but I'm not full-fledged yet with my new team. And I actually did a gig for them last night. Well, I was really kind of unsure because I got kind of pulled over, and I'm talking to this guy, and he goes, this is an officer guarding the door. And he goes, hey, has anybody gone up and talked to this guy? And I'm like, hey, yes, a police officer with a heart for ministry. And because unfortunately there are some people who are behind badges that, whether by mindset or statedness, they have a or trespass philosophy, and that doesn't really work. And then I had a guy on my church safety team years ago, and you've all heard about this guy over time, but he was a hammer in search of a nail. And we had a guy that came in and was troubled, and he was coming off some drugs, and he was really shook up. And this guy locked eyes with him, and the guy he locked eyes with was like, I'm a nail. And he was ready to run. I mean, he was just freaking out. And I had to tell this guy to stand down. He's like, he's a problem. I'm like, you don't have to kill him.
Right.
Which brings me over. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I've heard a lot of bad stories of police officers going in the middle of the sanctuary during service to arrest people that had warrants, for seatbelt tickets and traffic tickets. And so, God bless them. We have some great police officers that do church security that do get it. And then sometimes we stick them in there with no training and they don't understand and they're still on cop mode.
It's a totally different critter because I had a conversation last week with a pastor who was very frustrated with the way things were going with his safety team. And he's like, Paul, the way I look at it is the procedures are made for the people, not the people made for the procedures. I was like, ooh, gold nugget, I'm going to use that. And I said, well, here's the way I look at it. I work for you. And he looked at me and I said, if I had a safety team for you, if I'm part of your safety team and I come up to you and say, this guy came in, doesn't look right. We've gone up and engaged him. He said this, this, and this. He's looking for this and this. And you go, man, I've had a bad run-in with him. I think you need to escort him out. Guess what? You're my boss. I'm going to escort him out. But if you go, hey, let's love on this guy and let's pray with this guy, which I've probably already done, but let's do this, you're my boss. And I told him, I said, to me, church safety takes a very close back seat to ministry. It has to. And he's like, man, I wish more people got that. And then I think we're at a great segue point because this is, I'm about as giddy as a schoolgirl. This is where I think executive protection comes in. So, and if you're listening at home, this is where you need to be listening really closely. People like Matt, and I'm going to recommend you study with Matt. People like Matt are going to teach you things through executive protection that will let you protect your family on the street, in a restaurant, in your home, while driving, while traveling, and in your church, up to and including protecting your pastor. And let's rephrase the word executive protection and let's reframe it as pastoral protection. I've learned how to move somebody whose life is in danger while James and Mike engage the bad guy, or vice versa. And again, it's a shameless plug for you, but I learned all of that footwork and all of that think on the fly, high pressure stuff in a couple of your executive protection classes. And I hear there's another one coming up this year and I intend to attend. But I want to hand that off to you because I want you to unpack. And I like the way that Mike calls that unpack. I've started to borrow that word. Unpack for us what you feel executive protection can bring to the table for church safety.
Yeah, well, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, Paul. And I think that's that's where many people get hung up on protection as the hands-on problem solving. But if we, if we're aware and we're looking for things before they happen and we're doing a proper threat analysis, awareness is the currency that buys us time. And so, we don't want to just be a reactive component to when something happens and trying to stop it physically with being a super fighter or super gunfighter. And so I think what executive protection, the philosophies and concepts that I teach and that I've learned, it's really on the beginning side of that, which is precursor warning signs. Who's the bad guy? Who's the likely threat? How do you identify who the predator in the room is? What are they going to look like, sound like, act like, dress like? Reading body languages, those cues. And so, if you understand how to guard the president of the United States or how to guard the governor, then you understand how to guard your wife and children. You understand how to guard the pastor. You understand how to guard a building, okay? Because that's all wrapped into threat assessments. How to guard your house. You learn to think in a totally different lens of how to respond to a problem. One of the things on one of the very first assignments I ever went on, and I was overseas, I was in an area that you couldn't have a firearm. And it was a protection assignment, and I really didn't like it. And, I was talking to the team lead guy that was on it, and he said, if you had your firearm with you when we're route planning today, and we've got two different options, and one's 30 minutes faster to get to the next town that we're transporting the stuff to. And if you had your firearm with you and there was a 40% chance of danger that way, but the other route, which was 30 minutes longer, it was a 5% danger. Which one would you take if you had your firearm? I said, well, probably the one that had the 40% danger because I'd shoot myself out of it, And he said, exactly. And so he said, you win 100% of the fights you don't get into. We've all heard that phrase. And I think that church security, that is the most powerful statement. And we don't want to get into a gunfight at church. We don't want to get into a physical fight at church. We want to prevent those things before they happen. And until you really go through an executive protection type course, you don't really understand how to do a proper threat analysis, how to have contingency plans. You're kind of just training yourself with skills to react.
Yeah. I actually got to employ it ended up being a bust of a gig, but I got to actually employ threat assessment and looking at a site and from that attacker mindset. And it was really eye-opening for me because those of you that are at home that don't know the backstory, I sent all this off to Matt, and it would have been an operation pretty much in my neighborhood to protect a location. And it was a real eye-opener for me because it was that moment after I had downloaded the information that I Keanu Reeves and went, I know Kung Fu. I had that moment where it all started clicking, and I was like, wow, this is a skill set that has changed the way I think. Heck, it changes the way I sit in drive-thrus going through to get a meal. I mean, it literally, to me, it's become all inclusive. And if you're sitting at home and you're skeptical, I'm telling you what, I've trained in a lot of really cool things. And the thing that has impacted my mindset, for everything, but for church safety, period, hands down, it's been executive protection.
Well, yeah, we have to guard our pastor. A lot of pastors say, I'm not special. I'm not important. Why do you need to protect me? Put the extra body guarding the congregation. And it's like, his life's not more important than anybody else's, but he's been called. He's got a more important calling at this given time. And, if something, God forbid, happened, and several people lost their life at our church, we know that God is going to get us through it. We'll never get over it, but God will help us get through it. And our pastor, he's the one that's going to lead us through that. He's going to be the one that helps us through that. And so we really need him and his testimony and his leadership to help everybody kind of hold the church together, so to speak. Executive protection, another thing that's getting very popular is, church groups that they take somebody or a group of people, teenagers or women from their church, and they go to these conferences. That's very popular now. I mean, it's a big thing. And so, you and the security team, they're starting to be a component into that. And so route planning, hotels, threat analysis, threat assessments, doing a venue assessment. Where are we sitting in this venue? If something happened, how do I get these 8, 10, 12, 15 people? Where's our holding room? Where's our safe room? Where's our evacuation routes? If somebody on our bus, if we're, hurt or stabbed or whatever the case may be, where's the nearest hospital? Because in a crisis area, you're not going to get ambulance. You're not going to get police officers there that's going to be helping you if you're in a 9,000 person arena. And so, that's the value of not just doing security at your church, There's a lot of people there that they've always went to that building. They're familiar with church security at their building, but there's so much more that can be unlocked by going through an executive protection class, and you can provide a better service to your church, I think.
Amen. James?
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's interesting. You mentioned drive-throughs, Paul. I've been at a pharmacy before, picking up a prescription after surgery, and I've had somebody walk up between the building and my vehicle and start interacting with me. And so I was a little depressed at that moment, because I was coming from work, and actually it was a couple of days after my surgery, but I was coming from work and I didn't have my firearm on me, so I was a little nervous. But it really started making me think, okay, so how would I have handled that situation? It turned out okay, but in the future, what would I do different to stop that from happening, or get ahead of it? But one of the things you mentioned, Matt, that I kind of want to go back to is, you mentioned a lot of times pastors kind of deny, well, I'm not that important, or that sort of thing. And again, I've had that conversation with my pastor. I've had that conversation with several pastors. The realistic viewpoint, though, is whether the person can be replaced for that ministry or not, there's still the vocal and picture of that establishment, right? So that senior pastor, that main pastor that preached 2 weeks ago that maybe that abortion was wrong, or maybe instead of a divorce, you should try and reconcile with your spouse. I'm very good friends with a pastor at a church about 20 minutes away from me that preached against abortion. And 2 weeks later, his safety team actually pulled a guy out that had a knife that was like a, 3-4 inch blade knife that kept going after his family. He wasn't preaching, he was down in the sanctuary. They're like watching this guy, and they're like, okay, why is he moving towards the pastoral family? Let's jump in there. And they pulled him out. And once they realized, what was going on, they asked him, and he said, 2 weeks ago, this guy preached against abortion, and my girlfriend or fiance had an abortion 4 years ago, and I just didn't like what he said. Yeah. And so, that type of stuff, I think, happens far more than people want to think about, because we're so stuck in the, 40-year syndrome. 40 years ago, it was okay to do house calls, visitations, different things like that without a second thought. But, today the culture and the times have changed just a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I saw the funniest thing, to add some humor to this. I saw a cartoon picture the other day posted online, and it was this little boy standing next to his dad. And his dad had a jar of cookies up here. And the little boy was reaching like this, little 3-4-year-old boy. And he said, gimme, gimme, gimme. And the dad said, now, son, what do we say to get what we want? And he said, I'm offended. And we're living in that day and age in 2020, and people are offended. People are offended by what we're going to talk about on this. They're offended by what their pastor talks about. And, whether it was religious and, biblical or not, it may still offend them, even though it's in the Bible. And they often take it out on, the pastor.
So I want to follow in something that Mike says that I love is protect the quarterback, let them do what they do best in the pocket. And I had a couple follow-ups to that, because it's funny to me. I love the humility of a servant leader, whether they had a women's ministry or they're a pastor or whatever. I love the humility, but a lot of times they don't see the risks, because that's inherent to the way their personality is. They're looking out to help, and they will put themselves in harm's way unnecessarily. And we don't want to hamper their ministry, but we want to deflect some of the problems. And
right.
I literally saw when my pastor and just about best friend for 21 years, when he died, 2/3 of that congregation left over the first year. And that's actually par for the course with the death of a leader, or worse, with a leader who steps down under controversy. And that's how that shooting at Colorado Springs, Colorado came about, was where Carl Chin was one of their pastors had been found in a homosexual relationship. He was found to be using methamphetamine. And so there was a big hubbub, and it brought a lot of attention to their church. And then I actually had a conversation, and I want to throw this back to you because this is a really good vein, protecting people with this. And I want your thoughts on this as well, Matt. But there's a women's ministry that I was doing some executive protection work for. And the lady that heads up the ministry, she made a comment to me. She goes, well, I'm not that concerned about myself. And I'm like, Lord, I'd like to phone a friend. How do I help her to see this? And I said, you know, the scripture, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. And she's like, yeah. I said, you shepherd this group. I said, will this ministry continue if you die? And she goes, huh. And she's a great lady and has such a heart to help people. But we have to be as innocent as doves, but as shrewd as vipers. And I think in a lot of times in those situations, God bless them, the pastors and leaders in that environment, they're not wired to see it.
Yeah. No, we each have different callings for sure.
Yeah.
It's a unique environment for church security. Everybody has to work together. You're going to get pastors from different backgrounds. I've trained pastors that, they carry a gun on the stage, on the pulpit with them. And I've trained some pastors who want nothing to do with church security. It's totally a handoff. I want my team to understand this so that they can lead with it. A lot of what I do in church security in my beginning classes and working with the church organization is helping them understand why we need church security, what the importance is, and the biblical, legal, and moral justification for doing it. What I have found is if your pastor is against the idea, if your deacons are against the idea, or if your members are against the idea, it's just like an enemy. The best way to defeat them is from the inside out. And so the more people that we can educate on that and bring to see the light, so to speak, they don't all have to be warriors. But if they understand what we're doing and why we're doing it, we get less resistance. We get more support from the church body. The pastor has to understand what the church security team is and what their plan is. And so executive protection, in that class, we talk about teaching, the best way to defeat them, so that's your pastor. So the more people that we can educate on that and bring verbal signs, hand signs, so that they understand if they want to get removed from a certain situation, non-confrontationally, what kind of hand sign can they give so that we can come and escort them away. So yeah, it's a great thing. Our executive protection class, one of the highlights of that class, I think, Paul, you probably loved it the most, is the last night we do a live exercise. And so I assign team leaders, they get teams, then they get clients, so they have to go pick up clients at certain locations, take them to certain places, and it's a full-on live exercise out into the real world, and you get to actually put your skills and knowledge into place, a full threat assessment workup all the way into the protection detail and keeping it safe. And I may or may not throw some curveballs with some bad guys.
may or may not.
That's awesome. Real quick, and then I'll turn it over to Mike. You brought up some great points, and I wish I had time to go back. I'm like sitting here making notes on stuff that I want to call out, but so much of that in communicating with the pastor and having that and stepping forward and saying, hey, I might do security or safety, but this is what I want to see happen, really comes from the humility and the trust with that individual. We had a situation a couple of years ago where we had a family come in that was trying to reach another family in our church, and they were not welcome. They were trying to basically intimidate a witness at a trial the next day. And two of the family members that came in had felony sheets, felony active warrants, and basically enough warrants, that it's one of those things where it's like longer than your arm. And it was crazy because I had our senior pastor was on a missions trip in the Philippines. So stuff always happens when he's not around. But I had, a police commander from Columbus and one of the pastors walk up to me at one point, and they're like, so what do you want to do? And I'm like, what do I want to do? You're I'm like, you're the police officer that's had more experience in law enforcement than I've been alive. And he's
we don't hold that against him.
Yeah, right. He's also he's a good friend of mine, but he's also an attorney, and he's an attorney for the city. So, we have our jokes about that. But, I walked outside the building. He's like, let's go. And I said, where are we going? And he's like, we're doing an on-scene evaluation of how to handle this, how we want to pull this family out. So I walk outside the building, and literally there was probably 10 or 12 officers, no officers below the rank of sergeant, standing there. And they're like, as soon as we walk out, all of them turn around and look at me, and they're like, it's your show. What do you want us to do?
Yeah. Oh,
and,
yeah.
to me, that was the point where I was like, you know what? And we put a plan together, and I said, okay, what do you think about this? Let's do this. And it worked fantastic. We got great accolades from the city and how we handled it, and everything was great. But some of that, you have to establish that level of trust, because they were trusting. It wasn't just me. I mean, we were working together, but the reality is, if you push forward, and I'm just going to throw this in here, and then I'll turn over to Mike. But if you push forward and you don't have one of those groups agreeing with you and supporting your safety team, it is going to fail miserably. And I've learned that, from just personal experience. You might be able to push it through because, you're a ramrod and you're trying to get it done and you think it's the best thing. But at the end of the day, it has literally taken us over 10 years for me to be able to have the trust to go to my pastor and say, you know what, I'm going to put somebody with you to protect you and your family, because I don't like this situation. There's too many variables with this situation. And it's not, there's not a magic bullet that fixes everything instantly in some of these cases. But Paul has told the story before of an elder in his own church that was against safety teams, and he was the oversight elder for safety teams. So, yeah. Mike, what do you think?
Yeah, I think jumping in, couple points. I think you mentioned the humility. I think the trust and humility, absolutely. But I think part of it is there's two misnomers. You got people on the security team side that perceive the pastor protection is shadow protection, is exclusively Secret Service type, so close that you're basically their personal bodyguard. And I think there's an opportunity beyond that, whether that's zone or proximity coverage, that is a lot different. And I think there's even more so where you could cycle people out. It doesn't have to be the same person continually throughout the day. You don't want it looking like there's that person that's always their shadow and walking where they go. But I think also on the pastor side is letting them understand that the why, I think you addressed some of that, James, but also the how. In other words, how are we going to approach this? The zone coverage, the different pieces. And I think educating both sides of the house, if you will, may open that door to a true pastor protection setup that is both safer for them, but also more achievable by the safety team.
Right. Absolutely. Matt, you had something that you wanted to add?
Yeah, just with this, we talked about, trying to get our pastor and our deacons and elders and things on board with our idea of safety and security so they can kind of support us. Even the Bible tells us a prophet is never heard in his own land. Even when Jesus went back to his hometown, people didn't listen to him. And so many of you, you've called me, you've emailed me, I've worked with a lot of you who said, I have tried to convince my pastor. I've got a background of military law enforcement. You could be smarter than I am, and you're trying to convince your pastor, and he's just saying no. He doesn't support your idea for whatever reason. Don't get discouraged, and don't push so hard that it gets a solid no. Don't be afraid to call another professional. It doesn't have to be me, but another professional trainer. We're glad to come in. I offer free consultations for churches. I'll come in and I'll talk. I'll give a free, hour or 2 hours, session and try to convince them of why we need church security and why we need to do this in unity. And oftentimes, even though you were told no, I come in and talk. I might have said the exact same things you said. They give a big yes. Okay, so don't take it personal. Even the Bible warns us on that. So we're glad to do it. That's what we're here for.
That's awesome. Paul, did you we should probably go ahead and wrap up. Although I feel like we need to have you on again.
Sure, would love to anytime.
To talk about some more stuff. But Paul, did you want to add anything, and then we'll wrap up?
Well, since we're wrapping up, I mean, this guy and I could talk for hours. I always learn something. I've got a handful of people in my life that no matter what I do training with them, I always learn something new, and I love it. And Matt's one of these guys. And all I can really say right now is, other than yes, I agree, we need to have you back, is so now that folks know about you and they're interested and they're like, wow, this is cool, how do they get in touch with you?
Sure. So our website is novictimshere.com. You can find us on there, or sf-training.com. I think I've seen that scrolling on the screen some. Phone number is 417-838-1123. Give us a call. Give us you can email us info@shieldforce.org. That email, I'll see it, and we'll reach out. You can go to our website, fill out the contact button. Like I said, we do free consultations. I'll work with you. I want to make sure that I'm a good fit for any organization that I work with. Like we kind of talked about at the beginning of this show, my heart is in helping people. And I want to make sure that that's, kind of like Cinderella, that the slipper fits the right thing. I'm not about money. I'm probably a lot cheaper than a lot of my competition that do it, especially on the same scale that I do. Just in 3 years, I've trained a little over 6,000 church security members in 14 different states. So I've spoken at national conferences, big churches, mega churches, down to small churches with 40 people. And so I want to make sure that I can help you first, but we do that, and we'll help you along the way.
I'm going to throw and let you mention really, really quick. That is, I know that you also train realtors in self-defense, and you work to teach women how to defend themselves. And guys and gals listening to this at home, you've got a lot of women's ministries, and maybe they're out in public doing things. You've got daughters. Give us a quick heads up, Matt, on what you do with that.
Yes, I mean, everything self-defense related. I do a women's self-defense class just about every month. I do a personal securities class for individuals. I've actually got a big one coming up. It's going to be I think it's going to be sold out with our current social climate. But street survival, how to tell when you're being sized up, what to do if somebody tries to steal your car, what to do if you encounter protesters, and somebody's trying to rob you or take your car or hurt somebody. What personal safety skills do we need to know for all of that? I train everything from law enforcement to women to children, bank employees, active shooter, workplace violence, self-defense, verbal de-escalation, Chick-fil-A, drive-through people, leadership. We have a contemporary leadership class. One of my guys that works with us, he taught at the military's West Point, he went to military West Point from Los Angeles Police Department, Fire Department. They started their own West Point Leadership Academy, and he taught out there. So we've got a contemporary leadership class that's really cool.
Okay. Very cool.
Well, I find myself over here ready to go to your website, and not the least of which is Paul's endorsement. But I'm starting to sit there and say, okay, how long of a drive is it from Texas?
Exactly.
Because
I was just
not
thinking,
too far.
Where in Missouri again?
Quick.
Well, it's not too far, but I'm legit coming out of this, so we appreciate you coming on the show, Matt. And I'm certainly interested as one of those people that like to hang around with these guys. Always interested in training, and it sounds certainly that there's a lot that you bring to the table for different trainings that are there. And so I know without a doubt that there's something in that library that can help me out.
Absolutely.
Yes.
For sure. Well, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. Again, Matt, thanks for hanging with us tonight. And if you're at home watching this, there's definitely a great resource on the website. There's a lot of classes. There's a lot of information. So reach out to Matt and his team, and he travels all over the U.S. So
have done, will travel.
There you go. There you go. So anyhow, take care. Thanks for watching.
All right, there you have it, guys. We thank Matt Coombes for joining the broadcast. This is a previously recorded session. And I mentioned at the beginning of the show, for those that missed out, James was tied up tonight, and we had a minor emergency with a flat tire that Paul had to go in and be a rescue for. So thanks for tuning in. I did want to cover a couple of great things that Matt went over here, and talking about warrior mindset. willingness, decisiveness, and aggressiveness. And he brought up some great points about executive protection and how that ties into pastor protection, and how we can even bring that into the world of mobile. If you have conferences, if you're going after different ministries at your church that you may need to escort to an event, that you can look ahead and prepare and identify where there might be hospitals. What are your routes? What is your backup route? Different sorts of things. If you're brought into that sort of opportunity there. So a lot of really good stuff that Matt brought to the table tonight. And we hope you tune in again next week. Thanks a lot for joining us.